They called her too young. Too young for love, too foolish for marriage, too proud for a frontier town that chewed up dreamers and spat out dust. In Cedar Ridge, Wyoming, a girl of 18 was already on the shelf, a piece of unwanted goods. And Clarissa Hayes, standing on that train depot platform, with the December wind slicing through her thin wool coat, felt every bit of it. The snow fell in thick, wet flakes, each one a cold kiss of judgment. She could hear them, the town's hens, clucking behind her. Mrs. Peaton, whose voice could curdle milk from 50 paces, was the loudest. "Still playing with dolls in her mind," she squawked. "What man wants a child bride who won't act the part?" Laughter, thin and sharp like broken glass. Clarissa pretended to study the train schedule, the numbers blurring behind a wall of tears she refused to let fall. The words were stones they'd been throwing at her for years. Plain, peculiar, damaged. All because she'd turned down the Whitmore boy, a pig farmer with breath like a barn and hands that wandered. All because she'd seen the life her mother had lived, a slow, quiet death in a loveless marriage, and sworn she'd rather die in a blizzard than in a warm bed next to a man she didn't love. But in Cedar Ridge, that kind of thinking was a disease. "Clarissa Hayes!" Old Sam Murphy, the station master, bellowed from the ticket window. "Package for you." Every eye on the platform swiveled to her. The crowd of women parted like a sour sea, their skirts rustling with disapproval. She walked the gauntlet, her chin held high, her heart pounding a desperate rhythm against her ribs. Sam slid a small parcel wrapped in brown paper across the counter. "From your aunt in Missouri," he said, his voice softer than the others. He'd known her father before the bitterness had eaten him away. She whispered her thanks, turning to leave, but a wall of wool and whiskey blocked her path. Jonas Pike. He was 25, handsome in a cruel sort of way, and for months he'd been circling her like a coyote sizing up a lamb. His breath stank of cheap rye, a midday drunk powered by arrogance. "Well now, Miss Clarissa," he drawled, pitching his voice for the whole platform to hear. "Still too good for the likes of us?" The crowd behind him rumbled in agreement. This was the show they'd been waiting for. "Please let me pass, Mr. Pike." Her voice was a ghost, barely there. "Mr. Pike," he mocked, swaying. "So formal for a girl who'll be a spinster before she's 20. He leaned in closer, his pale eyes glittering with malice. "You think some prince is going to ride in on a white horse and sweep you away? You ain't that pretty, girl, and you ain't that young anymore." Someone from the crowd shouted, "Maybe she's waiting on one of them Comanche bucks." The laughter that followed was ugly, sharp, and it cut deeper than the wind. Clarissa clutched the small package to her chest like a shield. She felt herself shattering, just like her mother's little China shepherdess, the one her father had hurled against the wall in a rage. She was about to break. Jonas reached out, his grimy fingers aiming for her face. "Maybe someone just needs to teach little Miss High and Mighty what a real man can." She didn't wait to hear the rest. With a strength born of pure desperation, she shoved him. Hard. He stumbled back, cursing in surprise, and she ran. Her boots slipped on the icy planks, but she didn't stop. She fled, the sound of their laughter chasing her like a pack of wolves, ringing out like gunshots in the cold morning air. She ran past the mercantile, where Mr. Henderson just shook his head. She ran past the church, where Reverend Davis pretended not to see her. She ran until the town was a memory behind her, and the open, snow-covered fields stretched out like a blank page. The package from her aunt was long gone, dropped somewhere in her flight, but she didn't care. Only when her lungs burned with the fire of 1,000 icy needles did she slow, stumbling to a halt in the knee-deep powder. The humiliation was a furnace inside her, hotter than any winter wind. Too young, they said, but in that moment she felt ancient. She fell to her knees, the impact jarring her bones, and finally she let the tears come. They froze on her cheeks, tiny diamonds of sorrow. What do you think was in that package she dropped? Does it even matter now? She didn't know how long she knelt there, a lone, dark figure in a world of white. The wind picked up, a howling beast that whipped her mother's shawl from her shoulders and drove the snow into her face like stinging sand. This was it then. This was how it ended. not in some grand tragic gesture, but by simply walking too far into a storm because she was too proud and too hurt to turn back. A strange peace settled over her. The snow would cover her shame. She struggled to her feet, swaying. The world had vanished into a swirling vortex of white. She'd lost the town, the forest, everything. There was no direction home. Not that she had a home, just an empty house filled with ghosts and broken promises. Her next step plunged her into a drift up to her thighs. The cold was a strange, creeping warmth now, a dangerous lullaby. Her thoughts grew fuzzy. Distantly, she heard her mother singing, "Sleep now, my darling." "I'm sorry, Ma," she whispered to the wind. "I tried to be strong." The wind howled its reply, and Clarissa Hayes, the girl who was too young for love, sank into the snow's deep, soft, final embrace. But the Wyoming prairie wasn't finished with her, because out in that white blindness, something moved. Something large and dark, and impossibly fast. It wasn't a wolf or a bear. It was a man, and he was moving through the drifts, not like he was fighting them, but like he was a part of them. He was drawn by the single splash of color in the endless white, the bright blue of a fallen shawl. He was coming for her. The world had gone silent except for the scream of the wind. Clarissa was fading, drifting on a sea of cold. She fell one last time, and the snow felt like a feather bed. It would be so easy to just close her eyes. No more whispers, no more pain, no more loneliness. And then she saw him. He rose from the blizzard like a spirit carved from the storm itself. Impossibly tall, moving through the deep snow as if it were nothing. For a second, she thought death had come for her, and he was more magnificent than she could have imagined. But as he got closer, she saw he was a man of flesh and blood, a man unlike any she had ever seen. His chest was bare to the killing wind, a landscape of scars and muscle. Dark hair whipped around a face that looked like it was hacked from granite. And his eyes. Even as her vision swam, she saw his eyes. They were the color of rich, dark earth, and they held a calm that seemed to still the storm around him. A single word flickered in her dying mind, a word loaded with all the fear and warnings of her childhood. Comanche. They were savages, killers, heathens. That's what everyone in Cedar Ridge said. But as he knelt beside her, his movements were not wild. They were filled with a controlled, deliberate grace. He spoke, his voice a low rumble like distant thunder, in a language she didn't know. She couldn't respond. She had nothing left. He reached a large hand toward her face. She should have screamed. She should have fought. But she didn't. She looked into those earth-brown eyes and saw something that stopped her breath. It wasn't pity, it was recognition. Not of her, but of her pain. He saw the isolation, the judgment, the feeling of being an outcast. His fingers, impossibly warm against her frozen skin, gently brushed the ice tears from her cheeks. Then he saw it, the shawl, her mother's bright blue shawl, half buried in the snow. He picked it up with a reverence that shocked her, shaking the snow from it as if he understood its worth wasn't just in its wool. He wrapped it carefully around her shoulders, his hands lingering for a moment to make sure it was secure. That simple, tender act of care broke the last of her resolve. "Please," she whispered, not knowing if she was asking for death or for salvation. He studied her for a long moment, a decision passing over that stone-carved face. Then without a word, he scooped her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. He lifted her from her snowy grave, and the shock of being held, of being saved, of mattering enough for someone to carry, was the last thing she knew before the world spun away into darkness. What does a savage want with a half-frozen girl from a town that hates his people? She woke up to warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that was so profound it almost hurt. The air smelled of wood smoke, sage, and tanned leather. The wind still howled, but it was a muffled, distant sound now, held at bay by solid walls. She opened her eyes. She was in a small, round shelter, made of logs chinked with mud and moss. A fire crackled in a pit at the center, smoke curling lazily up through a hole in the roof. She was lying on a bed of thick buffalo robes, wrapped in more furs than she'd ever seen in her life. And he was there. He sat cross-legged by the fire, feeding it small branches. He'd put on a deerskin shirt, and his dark hair was tied back from his face. He seemed to sense her waking and turned his head. Those incredible eyes met hers. "You saved me," she croaked, her voice rough. He gave a single, slow nod. He reached for a wooden cup steaming by the fire and moved toward her. There was no threat in his movements, only a slow, deliberate purpose. He helped her sit up, his arms strong and steady behind her back, and held the cup to her lips. It was a bitter herbal tea, but it sent fire through her veins, chasing away the last of the deep chill. Over the rim of the cup, she studied him. He was younger than she first thought, maybe 30. There was a stillness about him, a comfort with silence that was entirely alien to the loud bragging men of Cedar Ridge. "Thank you," she managed when the cup was empty. He took it from her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second. A jolt went through her, a spark of pure, unadulterated awareness. He saw her, not as too young, not as too foolish, just as a person who needed help. The novelty of it made her eyes sting. He spoke again in his own tongue, the words flowing like water over stones. She shook her head to show she didn't understand. He fell silent, but then his hands moved. He gestured toward her feet. She looked down and gasped. He'd taken off her ruined, frozen boots. Her feet, which should have been frostbitten black, were swaddled in soft, warm rabbit fur. The intimacy of the act should have shocked her, scandalized her. A strange man had touched her bare feet, but there was nothing improper about it. It was just care. Practical, life-saving care. He moved back to the fire and ladled something from a simmering pot. The smell of rich stew filled the shelter, and her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was a physical pain. He brought her a bowl, venison, wild onions, and other herbs she couldn't name. The first spoonful was so good it almost made her cry. It wasn't just the food, it was the act of being fed, of being cared for. In her whole life, she had been the caregiver. For her sick mother, for her bitter father, for anyone in town who would pay a few coins for her labor. When was the last time someone had simply given her something, without expecting anything in return? As she ate, he moved about the small space, checking the walls, adding wood to the fire, adjusting the furs around her when a shiver ran through her. He moved with a quiet efficiency that spoke of a life lived in harmony with the harsh world, not in a constant fight against it. When the bowl was empty, a wave of exhaustion washed over her. He seemed to sense it. He took the bowl and gestured for her to lie back down. She should have been terrified. Alone, in a tiny shelter, with a Comanche warrior. But fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, and besides, he'd shown her more honor in a few hours than Jonas Pike had shown her in a lifetime. As she drifted off to sleep, she saw him settle by the door, his broad back to the wall, a silent guardian positioning himself between her and the world. He was a protector, everything the men of Cedar Ridge claimed to be, but never were. The storm raged outside, but inside the shelter, wrapped in furs that smelled of earth and smoke, Clarissa Hayes felt something she hadn't felt since she was a little girl at her mother's knee. She felt safe, but safety with a stranger in the middle of a wilderness is a fragile thing. What would he expect from her when the sun came up? Payment for his kindness? She was a woman alone, and she knew what men believed they were owed. The world was bright and silent when she woke. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape of crystalline white. He was still there, by the door, watching over her. He had kept the fire going all night. She sat up, her body aching with the good ache of survival, not the numb ache of death. She met his gaze and managed a small, tentative smile. Something in his expression softened in return. He spoke, and this time, she understood a single word. He touched his chest. "Talon. Talon," she repeated. His name. It suited him, like the claw of an eagle, sharp, strong, and sure. "I'm Clarissa," she said. "Clarissa," he repeated, shaping the sounds carefully. Her name sounded different in his mouth, stronger. He handed her more of the warm, bitter tea. As she drank, she wondered what came next. She couldn't stay here, but the thought of going back to Cedar Ridge, to the whispers and the leering eyes of Jonas Pike, was a cold knot of dread in her stomach. As if he could read her mind, Talon went to the door and looked out, then gestured toward the direction of town. It was a clear question. I, I can't go back, she said, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he'd understand the fear in her voice. They don't want me there. He watched her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to see right through to the heart of her. Then he picked up a charred stick from the fire and began to draw on the dirt floor. He drew a sun, then another, then a third. 3 suns. 3 days. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Was he asking her to stay? For 3 days? The impropriety of it screamed in her mind. An unmarried woman, alone with an Indian. Alone. It would utterly destroy what little reputation she had left. They would call her worse than a spinster. They would call her a whore. But then she pictured Jonas's sneering face. She heard Mrs. Peaton's shrill voice. What reputation was there to save? They had already judged and condemned her. Maybe. Maybe being ruined was a kind of freedom. She took the stick from his hand. Their fingers brushed again. That same electric spark. Below his 3 suns, she drew 3 more. 6 days. Let them talk. For 6 days she would stay in a place where she was seen not as a problem, but as a person worth saving. Talon nodded once, accepting her decision without question or judgment. Then he stood, reaching for a pair of snowshoes on the wall. He gestured to her, then to the shelter, and made a walking motion. He was going out to hunt, but he was telling her she would be safe here. Before he left, he added wood to the fire and pointed to the pot of stew, making sure she knew there was food. Such simple gestures, but they spoke a language louder than words. He cared if she was warm. He cared if she was fed. He cared if she was safe. The door closed, leaving her alone in the quiet warmth. Outside, the world was a vast, frozen wilderness. But inside this tiny hut, cared for by a man who spoke a different language, but understood the universal tongue of kindness, she had found the most unlikely sanctuary. For the first time in her life, Clarissa Hayes didn't feel too young, or too foolish, or too anything. She simply felt present. But 6 days is a long time to be alone with a man in the wilderness, a man who was a complete mystery, a man whose people were at war with her own. She looked at the scars on the buffalo robes, the strange symbols carved into his hunting bow. He had saved her life, yes. But who was Talon, really? And what did he truly want from her? Every act of kindness could be a trap. Every gentle gesture could be a lie. The days fell into a strange, peaceful rhythm. Talon would hunt, and she would tend the shelter. It was a quiet, domestic scene that felt both completely alien and deeply natural. He taught her things without words. He showed her how to bank the fire so it would burn all night. He showed her which dried herbs made the best tea. He taught her the difference between the track of a deer and the track of a wolf. She, in turn, taught him words. Fire, she'd say, pointing. Fire, he would repeat, his deep voice making the simple words sound profound. Snow. Water. Thank you. Each new word was a bridge built between their 2 separate worlds. But the silence was where she learned the most about him. She watched the way his hands, strong enough to kill a buck, could gently mend a tear in a moccasin. She watched the way he would pause before entering the shelter, as if asking permission to enter her space. One afternoon, a shadow fell over the doorway. Clarissa's heart leaped into her throat. A massive bear stood there, drawn by the smell of their cooking stew. It rose on its hind legs, a tower of fur and teeth, its black eyes fixed on her. She was frozen with terror, a scream trapped in her throat. Before she could even think, Talon was there. He hadn't been in the shelter, but he appeared as if from nowhere, silent as a ghost. He didn't have his bow or his knife. He simply stood between her and the bear. He made no sudden moves. He just stood his ground, a calm, immovable force. He spoke to the bear, not in his own language, but in a series of low, guttural clicks and rumbles. It wasn't a challenge. It was a conversation. The bear watched him for a long, tense minute. It dropped back to all fours, gave a low snort, and then, impossibly, it turned and ambled away into the forest. Talon turned back to her. He saw the terror on her face. He stepped forward and did something that shocked her more than the bear had. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a lover's touch. It was a gesture of pure comfort. The warmth of his hand seeped through her dress, a steady, reassuring presence. "No harm," he said, one of the few English phrases he knew. That night she couldn't sleep. The image of him facing down the bear was burned into her mind. Who was this man? Was he a sorcerer who could speak to animals? Was he more than just a man? To distract herself from her racing thoughts, she decided to tidy his few belongings. In a small leather pouch, she found something that made her blood run cold. It was a scalp. Long blonde hair, tied with a blue ribbon, the kind of ribbon the girls in Cedar Ridge wore. The shelter, which had felt like a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a cage. The man who had saved her, who had shown her such tenderness, was a killer, a savage, just like they said. The warmth she had felt for him turned to ice. He was a monster, and she was trapped with him. She must have made a sound because he stirred from his place by the door. In the dim firelight, she saw him sit up, his eyes questioning her. She held up the horrifying object, her hands shaking. His face showed no surprise, no guilt. He looked at the scalp, and then at her, and his expression was one of deep, profound sadness. He stood up and came toward her. She scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs. He was going to kill her too, but he didn't. He stopped a few feet away and began to speak, this time in a torrent of his own language, his voice filled with an anguish she couldn't understand. But his hands told the story. He gestured to the scalp. He made the shape of a woman, then a small child. He pointed to the east toward the rising sun. Then he drew his finger across his own throat, his face a mask of grief. He pointed to his chest, to the scars there, and then he pointed at the scalp again. He was trying to tell her something. Not a story of triumph, a story of loss. But what did it mean? Was he a grieving husband? Or a cold-blooded killer trying to trick her? She was alone, miles from anyone, with a man who kept a human scalp in his bag. The 6 days she had agreed to suddenly felt like a death sentence. The next morning, the fragile peace between them was shattered. A tense, heavy silence filled the shelter. Clarissa couldn't look at him without seeing that horrifying trophy. Every move he made seemed like a threat. When he sharpened his knife, she flinched. When he looked at her, she saw a predator in his eyes. Talon seemed to understand her fear. He kept his distance, his face carved from stone. But the shelter had become a prison for them both. That afternoon, he did something different. He took out a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of bark and began to draw. He was a surprisingly skilled artist. He drew a picture of a man, a woman with long blonde hair, and a little girl. He drew them standing in front of a cabin. Then he drew other men, white men with rifles. He drew fire and smoke, and then he drew the man, the woman, and the child lying on the ground. He looked at Clarissa, his eyes begging her to understand. He wasn't the killer. He was a witness. He added to the drawing. He drew himself younger, finding the scene after the attackers had left. He drew himself burying the bodies. And then he drew himself cutting a lock of the woman's hair. Not as a trophy of war, as a memento, a promise to remember. Clarissa stared at the drawing, the story unfolding in the simple charcoal lines. This wasn't the hair of an enemy. It was the hair of someone he had tried to save, or someone he had sworn to avenge. This act, which had terrified her, was an act of honor. The tension in her body eased, replaced by a wave of shame. She had judged him, just as the people of Cedar Ridge had judged her. She had looked at him and seen a savage, because that's what she had been taught to see. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. She saw the grief in his eyes, the deep lines of sorrow that she had mistaken for cruelty. She reached out and, with a trembling finger, touched the drawing of the woman with the blonde hair. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He reached out and gently covered her hand with his. His touch was no longer a threat. It was a comfort. It was the touch of another lonely soul. That night, as a new snow began to fall outside, he did not sit by the door. He built up the fire and then sat across from her. He took out the scalp, the lock of hair, and handled it with a tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. He began to speak, his voice low and soft. He knew she couldn't understand, but he told the story anyway. He was releasing his grief, and he had chosen her to be his witness. She listened for hours, the rhythms of his language washing over her. She didn't need to understand the words to understand the pain, the loss, the rage, the sorrow. When he was finished, a deep silence settled over the shelter. He carefully placed the lock of hair into the fire. They watched together as it curled and burned, the blue ribbon turning to black ash. He was letting go. He was freeing himself from the past, and he had allowed her to be part of it. In that moment, he was no longer a Comanche warrior, and she was no longer a white woman. They were just two people, survivors of different kinds of brutality, finding a moment of connection in a small, warm shelter while the world outside was cold and unforgiving. The sixth day, their last agreed-upon day, dawned bright and clear. The time had come for a decision. But the choice was no longer just about her. It was about him, too. And she realized something that shook her to her core. The thought of leaving him, of never seeing him again, was an unbearable pain. When had that happened? When had this stranger, this man of a different people, a different world, become so important to her? He seemed to feel it too. There was a new tension in the air, but it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something fragile and powerful and terrifying. He gestured toward the town, then looked at her. A question. She shook her head. Not back there. Not yet. Then he did something that made her heart stop. He pointed to the west toward the towering snow-capped mountains. He made the sign of a bird in flight, a talon. Then he pointed to himself. Then he pointed to her and made the same sign. He was asking her to come with him, to his people, to a life she couldn't even begin to imagine. It was an impossible choice. To return to a world that had rejected her, or to step into a world that might never accept her. Before she could answer, a sound from outside interrupted them. The sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the silent forest. They both froze. Another shot, closer this time. Talon moved with lightning speed. He grabbed his bow and a quiver of arrows, his face a grim mask. He motioned for her to stay down, away from the door. Someone was out there, and they were hunting. But were they hunting animals, or were they hunting them? The rifle shots were getting closer. Talon peered through a tiny crack in the logs. His body went rigid. He turned to Clarissa, his eyes dark with a new kind of urgency. He held up two fingers, then made a motion like a snake, the sign for a white man. Two men, and they were coming straight for the shelter. Clarissa's blood ran cold. Had someone from town followed her? Had Jonas Pike come to drag her back? Talon didn't wait to find out. He grabbed a buffalo robe and threw it over a pile of firewood, creating a small, dark space. He pushed her toward it, his message clear. Hide and do not make a sound. She crawled into the cramped space, her heart pounding so hard she was sure they could hear it. Through a small gap in the furs, she could see Talon. He knocked an arrow to his bow, his movements fluid and deadly silent. He wasn't a man of peace anymore. He was a warrior, ready to defend his home. The crunch of boots on snow grew louder, stopping just outside the door. "I know you're in there, savage," a voice bellowed. It wasn't Jonas Pike. The voice was older, rougher. "We saw the smoke," another voice called out. "This is our trapping line. You've got no business on this land." There was a loud thud as someone kicked the door. "Come on out, or we're coming in." Clarissa held her breath. She saw Talon draw the bowstring back, his knuckles white. He was going to kill them. It would be self-defense, but they were white men. If he killed them, he'd be hunted for the rest of his life. "I said, come out!" The voice roared, followed by the splintering sound of an axe hitting the door. Talon let out a low, guttural cry, a Comanche war cry that chilled Clarissa to the bone. He was ready for a fight to the death. But Clarissa couldn't let it happen. She couldn't let him die for her. Before he could release the arrow, before the trappers could break down the door, she scrambled out of her hiding place. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice raw with panic. "Don't shoot!" She threw herself in front of Talon, shielding him with her own body. The axe stopped mid-swing. The door, now split and hanging from one hinge, was pushed open. Two grizzled, bearded men stood there, their rifles half raised, their faces a mixture of shock and confusion. They stared at her, A white woman in a deerskin dress she had borrowed from Talon's supplies, standing in front of a Comanche warrior with a drawn bow. "What in God's name?" the first trapper whispered. "Are you all right, miss?" the second one asked, lowering his rifle. "Is he holding you captive?" Clarissa looked from their bewildered faces to the deadly point of Talon's arrow, still aimed at the first trapper's chest. "He is not," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "He saved my life. This is his home. You are the trespassers." The men exchanged a look of disbelief. "Miss, you don't understand," the first one said slowly, as if talking to a child. "He's a Comanche. They ain't to be trusted. He has shown me more trust and honor than any white man I have ever known," she shot back, her fear turning to anger. "Now lower your weapons and leave this place." Talon had not moved. His bow was still drawn, his focus absolute. The slightest twitch from the trappers, and he would release the arrow. "Now hold on a minute," the trapper said, his patience wearing thin. "We ain't leaving. This is our land. We got papers." "This land belonged to his people long before your papers," Clarissa said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. The first trapper's eyes narrowed. He looked past her, at Talon. "You understand English, boy," he snarled. "You tell your little white squaw to get out of the way before she gets hurt." Talon did not reply. He just held his aim. The situation was a powder keg, ready to explode. Clarissa knew she had to do something drastic. She slowly reached up and pushed the sharp point of Talon's arrow away from the trapper and pressed it against her own chest. "If you shoot him," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "you will have to shoot through me first." The trappers stared at her, their mouths agape. They had come looking for a fight with a lone Indian. They had not expected to find a defiant white woman willing to die for him. What would you do in that situation? Would you back down? The standoff held for a long, silent moment. The only sound was the drip of melting snow from the eaves. The trappers were clearly shaken. This was not the simple fight they had anticipated. Finally, the second trapper nudged the first. "Jed," he muttered, "let's just go. It ain't worth it." Jed hesitated, his pride fighting with his common sense. He glared at Clarissa, his eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and grudging respect. "You're a fool, girl," he spat. "When he turns on you, don't come crying to us." He lowered his rifle, and after a moment, his companion did the same. Without another word, they turned and tramped back into the forest. Clarissa stood frozen until the sound of their footsteps faded away. Only then did she realize she was still pressing the arrowhead into her own chest. She let out a shuddering breath, and her knees buckled. Talon caught her before she hit the floor. He gently took the bow from her, his hands covering hers. He looked at her, his dark eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't name. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was something more. "You. Fight," he said, the English words sounding rough and new. "I couldn't let them kill you," she whispered. "You saved my life," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved mine first," she replied. He helped her to the furs by the fire, then went to repair the broken door. As she watched him work, his strong hands skillfully weaving leather strips to bind the split wood, she understood. The choice had been made for her. Her place was here, with him. The thought no longer terrified her. It felt right. It felt like coming home. When the door was secure, he came and sat with her. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the shelter. "We must go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They will bring more men." She knew he was right. The trappers would go back to the nearest town and tell their story. A white woman living with a Comanche. They would form a posse. They would call it a rescue. But it would be a massacre. "Where will we go?" she asked. He looked to the west, toward the mountains. "My people," he said. There was no more hesitation, no more doubt. "Yes," she said, "take me to your people." They left that night, under the cover of a crescent moon. They traveled light and fast, Talon leading the way through the dark forest with an instinct that seemed supernatural. Clarissa followed, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was leaving everything she had ever known behind. She was stepping off the edge of the map. They traveled for 2 days, pushing themselves to the limit. On the third morning, they reached the foothills of the Great Mountains. Talon stopped and pointed to a thin plume of smoke rising from a distant valley. "Cedar Ridge," he said. She stared at the smoke, a smudge of civilization against the vast wilderness. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had run from that town, a broken, terrified girl. Now she was a different person. She was a woman who had faced down bears and armed men, a woman who had chosen her own path. "Do you want to go back?" Talon asked, his eyes searching her face. It was a real question. He would take her back if she asked. He would face the town, the prejudice, the danger for her. She looked from the smoke of Cedar Ridge to the towering peaks of the mountains. Behind her was a life of judgment and constraints. Ahead was a life of uncertainty and freedom. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. "My home is not there anymore." She turned her horse to the west and didn't look back. But leaving the past behind is never that simple. Someone in Cedar Ridge had seen the smoke from Talon's shelter too, and they were not as willing to let her go. Jonas Pike had been stewing for days, his pride wounded, his obsession growing with every drink. When the trappers returned with their wild story of a white woman defending a savage, his rage boiled over. He didn't need a posse. He would go himself. He would rescue her, whether she wanted it or not. He would bring her back and make her his wife. He would break her spirit just as she had broken his pride. He saddled his horse, his mind a feverish swamp of whiskey and revenge. He was coming for her, and this time he would not be denied. As Clarissa and Talon climbed higher into the mountains, they had no idea that a far greater danger than any bear or trapper was tracking them, fueled by a madness that would not be satisfied until it had destroyed everything in its path. The mountain air was thin and cold, but Clarissa felt a fire in her blood. Each step her horse took was a step further away from the girl she used to be. Talon rode beside her, a silent, comforting presence. He would occasionally point out a landmark or the track of a mountain lion, teaching her the language of this new wild world. They were a team, a strange, unlikely pair from two warring worlds, united by circumstance and a bond that was growing stronger with every mile. One night, as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, he took her hand. He traced the lines on her palm with his finger, his touch sending shivers down her spine. "You are brave," he said, his English improving with every conversation, like a she-wolf who protects her den. "I was so scared," she confessed. "Brave is not no fear," he said, his dark eyes serious. "Brave is fear. But you stand anyway. You stand." She realized he wasn't just talking about the trappers. He was talking about Cedar Ridge. He was talking about her entire life. He saw her, the real her, in a way no one ever had before. He began to tell her about his people, the Comanche. Not the savages of her childhood stories, but a proud, strong nation with deep traditions and a fierce love for the land. He told her about his family, his mother, a wise woman, his sister, as wild and free as he was. "They will, like me?" she asked, her voice small. "My mother will see your spirit," he said. "My sister will see your fire. Some will see only your white skin, like your people see only my red skin. But the ones who matter, they will see you." As he spoke, she felt the last of her fears about her old life fall away. What did the judgment of Cedar Ridge matter when this man, this incredible man, saw her with such clarity? But as they drew closer to their destination, a new fear began to grow. What if his people rejected her? What if she couldn't fit in? What if, after all this, she was still an outcast? Talon seemed to sense her anxiety. "Do not be afraid," he said. "You will not be alone. I stand with you, always." It was a promise, and she believed him. On the seventh day of their journey, they crested a high pass. Below them, nestled in a valley protected by the mountains, was a village. Dozens of teepees stood in a large circle, smoke rising from their tops. Horses grazed in a nearby meadow. The sounds of life, children laughing, dogs barking, the rhythmic beat of a drum, drifted up to them on the wind. "We are here," Talon said, a note of pride in his voice. "This is my home." It was beautiful. It was terrifying. As they rode down into the valley, people stopped what they were doing to stare. A ripple of curiosity and suspicion spread through the village. A white woman, here, with Talon. An older woman with a strong, noble face and eyes as dark and wise as Talon's emerged from the largest teepee. She strode toward them, her gaze sharp and assessing. This was his mother, Clarissa knew. Talon dismounted and spoke to her in their language, his voice respectful. He told her the whole story, the storm, the rescue, the trappers, everything. His mother listened without expression, her eyes never leaving Clarissa's face. When he was finished, the woman stepped forward and looked Clarissa up and down. Clarissa's heart pounded. This was the moment. Acceptance or rejection. Then the woman spoke, in accented but clear English. He says you have the spirit of a warrior. Is this true? Clarissa lifted her chin. I do what I must to survive, she said. The woman's stern face broke into a small, knowing smile. That is the spirit of a warrior. Welcome to our home, Clarissa Hayes. You are safe here. Relief washed over Clarissa so powerfully she almost wept. But just as she began to relax, a new figure emerged from the crowd. A tall, handsome warrior with a cruel twist to his lips and cold, hard eyes. He looked at Clarissa with open contempt, then turned to Talon. You bring a white woman into our camp? He sneered in Comanche. Have you gone mad, brother? Talo's face hardened. She is under my protection, Black Moon. Protection? Black Moon laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. She is a spy, a disease. She will bring the soldiers down on us. A murmur went through the crowd. Black Moon was a respected war leader. His words carried weight. She is a guest, Talon's mother said, her voice sharp as flint. And she will be treated with honor. Honor? Black Moon spat on the ground. There is no honor in consorting with the enemy. I say we send her back, or kill her now. The friendly welcome had turned into a hostile confrontation. Clarissa stood frozen, understanding only the hatred in Black Moon's eyes. She had escaped one prison only to find herself in another. She had fled the judgment of Jonas Pike, only to face the hatred of Black Moon. Talon stepped in front of her, shielding her. You will not touch her, he said, his voice a low growl. Then I will go through you, Black Moon replied, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. The two warriors faced each other, years of rivalry and bitterness simmering between them. The entire village watched, waiting to see who would back down. But from the back of the crowd, a new sound emerged. The thunder of hoofbeats. A single rider, pushing his horse to its absolute limit, galloped into the center of the camp. It was Jonas Pike. His face was wild, his clothes were torn, and his eyes burned with a mad fire. He had a rifle in his hands, and it was aimed directly at Talon. Get away from her, you filthy savage! He screamed, his voice cracking with madness. The world seemed to stop. The Comanche warriors were frozen in shock at the sudden appearance of this crazed white man. Clarissa could only stare, horrified. Jonas had found her. He had followed them all this way, and he had brought his hatred and his violence with him. Clarissa, he yelled, his eyes pleading and furious at the same time. I've come to save you. Come with me. Now! Jonas, no, she cried. Go home. You don't know what you're doing. I know that he's brainwashed you, Jonas screamed, his knuckles white on the rifle. I'm taking you back. Black Moon saw his chance. The white man is here to kill us, he shouted in Comanche. Kill him! Several warriors started to move, but Talon held up a hand. No, he commanded. This is my fight. He started to walk slowly toward Jonas, his hands empty and open at his sides. Stay back, Jonas shrieked, his aim wavering. I'll kill you. You have followed us for many miles, Talon said, his voice calm and steady. You are tired. You are angry, but this is not the way. She's mine, Jonas sobbed, tears of rage and frustration streaming down his face. She was supposed to be mine. In that moment, Clarissa didn't see a monster. She saw a broken, pathetic man, twisted by a world that had taught him that owning a woman was his right. She stepped out from behind Talon. Jonas, it's over, she said, her voice soft. I am not a prize to be won. I am a person, and I choose to be here. Her words were like a physical blow. Jonas staggered, his face crumbling. He had lost. He knew it. His finger tightened on the trigger. If he couldn't have her, no one would. He swung the rifle from Talon and aimed it straight at Clarissa's heart. There was a deafening boom. But it wasn't Jonas's rifle. From the side, a single arrow, swift and silent as death, flew through the air. It struck Jonas in the shoulder, knocking him from his horse. His rifle clattered to the ground as he screamed in pain. Clarissa stared in shock. Standing with a bow in her hand was a young Comanche woman with fire in her eyes, Talon's sister. Black Moon roared in fury and charged at the wounded Jonas, his knife raised high. He was going to finish him. "No!" Clarissa screamed, and without thinking, she ran and threw herself over Jonas's body, shielding him from Black Moon's blade. Everyone stared, stunned, into silence. The white woman, who they thought was an enemy, was protecting the man who had just tried to kill her. She looked up at Black Moon, her eyes blazing. "There has been enough killing," she said, her voice ringing through the silent camp. "It ends. Now." Black Moon froze, his knife inches from her face. He looked from her defiant eyes to Talon, who was now standing beside her. He looked at the faces of the villagers. He saw not bloodlust, but a dawning respect. He slowly lowered his knife. The confrontation was over. They treated Jonas's wound, and under Talon's mother's orders, they did not kill him. They would send him back to his people, with a message that the Comanche were not murderers, but they would defend their own. As Clarissa cleaned the dirt from Jonas's wound, he looked at her, his eyes finally clear of the madness. "Why?" he whispered. "Why did you save me?" "Because that's what decent people do, Jonas," she said quietly. "They don't own each other. They don't hurt each other. They help each other, even when it's hard." Later that evening, as the stars came out over the mountains, Clarissa stood with Talon and his family. The village was quiet. The drama of the day settled. Talon's mother placed a hand on Clarissa's shoulder. "My son said you had the spirit of a warrior," she said. "He was wrong. You have the spirit of a chief." Talon took her hand. "You have a home here now, Clarissa," he said. "If you choose it." She looked at the faces around her. Talon, his fierce sister, his wise mother. She looked at the towering mountains that had become her sanctuary. She thought of the girl who had knelt freezing in the snow, a girl who had felt utterly alone in the world. She was not that girl anymore. "I have already chosen," she said, her voice filled with a peace she had never known. She had been called too young for love, but she had learned that true love wasn't about age or propriety. It was about respect. It was about courage. It was about choosing kindness over cruelty and freedom over fear. She had found her love, not just in Talon, but in herself. She was a survivor. She was a warrior. She was a chief. And her story was just beginning. If you enjoyed Clarissa's incredible journey of survival and self-discovery, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Every story has a hero, but sometimes the greatest battles are the ones we fight inside ourselves. Let me know in the comments what you think was the bravest thing Clarissa did. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.